Titled Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? We always base our programs around what people are thinking about and what people are asking about. And of course, this is, besides for being a very popular topic, this is also a very painful topic. But it does deserve some time to think about it and to discuss. And there's no better person to discuss this than Rabbi Friedman, who has been dealing with this good times, not so good times for many, many years, and teaching people on what's the Jewish way, what's the kosher way, what's the proper way to handle these things. Now, of course, the questions that came in are very painful and they need to be addressed, and we will get to them. But first, we'd like to get to just a few words on this topic and what is the kosher way to ask, and then what is the kosher way to answer. Rabbi Friedman.
The title of the question, or the title of the talk, why do bad things happen to good people? That obviously assumes that bad things do happen to good people. That's not precisely correct, and the title would have been better if it was the question, do bad things happen to good people? But we went with why because there is a certain virtue. Before we even get to an answer, there's a certain virtue to the question itself. In fact, Moshe Rabbeinu asked that question when things got worse for the Jews after he first spoke to Pharaoh. Moshe asked God, why? Why did things get worse? Why did you make it harder? And although Moshe was criticized for the question, it was acceptable, or let's say necessary. When a person asks why, they don't necessarily want an answer. They're not asking for information, they're not asking for an education, they're not asking for a lecture on the benefits of suffering. When we ask why, we're simply expressing a pain, we're expressing an objection, a discomfort. We can't accept this, we can't get comfortable with this. So the why is not an intellectual question. If you really want to know and understand the function of suffering in the world, you would ask what? What is the benefit of suffering? Or what is the purpose of suffering? But when you say why, in many cases, it's not even meant to be a question, it's an objection. Very much like a kid who says, why do I have to go to sleep now? He's not asking for a lecture on the benefits of sleep. He's simply saying, I don't want to. Why do I have to? Which means I'm not going. So it's an objection, it's a refusal, it's the inability to accept comfortably something that goes against the grain. So we left the question as to why do bad things happen to good people? As we will see, the sages ask the question differently. The sages ask, why do the righteous suffer? It's a different question. There's no mention of bad. There's a mention of suffering, which we'll explain in a minute. Another thing about why do the righteous suffer, or why do bad things happen to good people, is the obvious belief and assumption that good people do suffer, meaning that you cannot dismiss the goodness of the person based on the fact that they suffer. Because there was, or maybe there is, a response or a reaction like that. Good people don't suffer. If you're suffering, then you're not good people. Because whether you're righteous or not righteous can be measured, can be known by the lifestyle or the life quality that you have. If your life is great, then you must be a great person. If your life is full of pain, you must be a terrible person. Now, we know that that's not true because Job suffered more than anybody else, and he was a tzaddik. He was a totally righteous person. And the Torah is telling us that with a strong emphasis on his righteousness. No place does it mention how bad he was or how sinful he was. So we should immediately dismiss this possibility that if there is suffering in one's life, that indicates or proves that this individual was not completely righteous. The fact that suffering is sometimes a punishment for sin should not confuse us. There are moments, there are times when we suffer the consequences of our sins. But that would always have to make sense. The suffering or the punishment would have to fit the crime. When innocent people are dying, and you try to blame it on the sins of others, that's getting desperate. That is not reward and punishment. Reward and punishment means you get what you deserve. So how would we explain the 210 years of horrific slavery in Egypt when we hadn't even been given the Torah yet? So what kind of a sin could we be paying for with 210 years of slavery? And who suffered in that slavery? The men, of course, but the women, the children. Did they all sin? So it's obvious and clear that suffering is, in the extreme examples of suffering are hardly ever punishment for sin. Now, there's the sentiment or the statement that we make in the davening, it is because of our sins that we have been exiled from our land. So we're blaming all of exile. Almost 2,000 years of exile is being blamed on our sins. So people have suffered for 2,000 years because 2,000 years ago, our ancestors did something wrong. How can any right-minded person accept such a statement? Of course, the Torah says, so it's true. But we have to understand what it's saying. Because of our sins, we are exiled from our land. The emphasis is exiled from the land, not suffering inquisitions and pogroms. The fact that we're not in our land, that is the result of our sin. And what it means is something like this. We are, of course, as a chosen people, meant to influence the whole world. Had we not sinned, we would be able to influence the world and achieve our goal without ever leaving the Holy Land. How would we influence the rest of the world? They would come to Israel asking for instruction, for guidance, for inspiration. And for a short time, that was actually happening under King Solomon. Under Shlomo HaMelech, when we had the Beis HaMikdash, everyone in the world came to seek wisdom in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land. So we could have affected the whole world without ever leaving home. Because of our sins, we now have to affect the world by going to the world rather than having the world come to us. That makes the punishment a little more appropriate to the sin. And it also tells us that the fact that we are here in exile and have been here for 2,000 years is primarily because it's our job to affect the world. The effects of the sin is only the method by which we do it. So, number one, not all suffering comes from sin. If there is suffering coming from sin, it would have to be commensurate with the sin. So the Gemara says that if you stub your toe, that's punishment for sin. And if you're frustrated because you reached into your pocket to pull out a quarter and you pulled out a nickel, and now you have to reach back into your pocket to get the quarter, that's punishment for sin. Because it's an aggravation. So how do we compare the aggravation of having to reach into your pocket a second time with an inquisition or the destruction of the temple? Most suffering, we have to assume, has nothing to do with sin, because nobody deserves this kind of suffering. No sin deserves this kind of suffering. So there must be more to it than what meets the eye. Number two, the fact that somebody suffers is not an indication that they're not righteous. In fact, it could be the opposite. The more righteous a person is, the more capable he is of handling the hard jobs, the difficult jobs, which involve suffering. So here's the first thing we need to get straight in our heads. God created this world as a messed up, bad world. It's the lowest of all possible worlds. What makes it the lowest of all possible worlds? Every world, and we're told in Kabbalah that there are 4 worlds, major worlds, there are infinite worlds, but they're all spiritual, various degrees of spiritual, of godly. The highest of all worlds is a universe or a condition in which God is so obvious that there is no possibility of anything ungodly. The lowest world would be a world that is not capable of being godly. And such a world God would never create, because what would be the purpose? So this world, the world that we're in, is the lowest of all worlds, because in this world you have the option of denying God. Of course, you also have the option of getting to know him. But a world that can deny him, that's as low as we can get. The next step after that would be a world in which you cannot know him even if you wanted to. And such a world could not exist, would not justify itself. So we are in the lowest world. What constitutes the lowest world? Well, in the lowest world, there's more mortality. Adam and Chava were placed in the Garden of Eden, but there was no death there. So that was not the lowest world. When they ate from the tree, they came down to the lowest world, the world of mortality. Along with mortality comes pain. Beginning, of course, with the fear of dying. So in a mortal world, a mortal human being always has that anxiety, always has that fear, the fear of death, or in the positive, the survival instinct. So now we know that there is death, we know that there is suffering, there's pain. The idea that human beings messed up the world is not acceptable. The world was created as the lowest world. It has great potential. And if we do our job properly, we can bring that potential into actuality and turn this world into not only a godly place, but the godliest of all worlds. Because when you transform darkness into light, that is the greatest revelation of godliness. Because it shows that no matter how big the pain and no matter how low the world, the truth will always prevail and godliness will always win in the end. And that reveals godliness more than a world in which there is nothing ever bad. So we come into this world knowing it's a messed up world, and it's our job to fix it. So when we see the mess, when we come face to face with the mess, with the pain, with the grief, with all the ugliness of it, we're not surprised. We know we're coming into a low world. In fact, we assess it. Say, okay, I got to clean this one up. Let's see, how do we go about that? How can we clean up this world? Now, in history, we have had experiences. There were times when we encountered such a mess. The world showed itself to be so evil, not just people, even nature, tsunamis, plagues. And when we encountered that unexpected evil, it kind of knocked us off our track for a while. We were defeated. We can clean up a mess, but not such a mess. We can take on a world where there's a lack of godliness, but when there is so much pain and so much evil, this can't be cleaned up. This will never get fixed, and we were defeated for a while. So after the destruction of the temple, we didn't know if we could ever get back on our feet. It was too much. It was overwhelming. And then the Inquisition and the life in the ghettos and in the shtetls and in the concentration camps. Well, this is too much. This is too much. We didn't know that this was part of the deal. And so for a generation or two, we're paralyzed. We're incapable. We can't see our way. We can't see a future. We can't see anything ever getting better. I was speaking to a teenager whose life had been one long, miserable, painful, horrible suffering. And she said, I don't believe in Mashiach. I don't believe in God. The world is really, really bad. And all of these Pollyanna answers that it'll all be good. I don't buy it anymore. So I said, okay, so where do you go from here? She says, well, now that I know how bad things are, when I get older, I'll find a way to make things better. Yeah. So I said, you're going to make things better? You just told me how terrible this world is. Why do you think it can get better? And she said, no, it can always get better. You're the biggest believer I've ever met. You claim not to believe in Mashiach and not to believe in God. You're the ultimate believer. You know how bad things are, and you're convinced that they can get better. That's fantastic. Okay. So what we're saying is, the world is bad. We didn't mess it up. We didn't start the fire. It's a messed up world. And we know that it's our job to fix it. And we've seen in the past where we thought we were overwhelmed, we thought we had lost the battle, because we couldn't imagine fixing such a messed up world. And a generation later, we were back on our feet, doing whatever we can to make the world better. So the first thing we need to know when we experience bad things like a cold or something, when we experience a bad thing, the first thing we need to know is that's the process. Nothing went wrong. The plan has not been messed up. This is the plan. It's a very painful world, and we were given a painful job. but it's a good job, a necessary job, and a job that we can succeed at. Then there's another thing. When we say bad things are happening, what do we mean by bad? It's a tiny little word, a very familiar word, but what is its precise meaning? Is death bad? On some cosmic level, probably, because we're looking forward to a time when death will be removed from the earth, which would be good. But on a more human level, death is not necessarily bad. We get upset over what we call wrongful death. A normal death, guy's 107 and passes away in bed comfortably surrounded by his family, it's sad, it's not bad. Nobody gets morally outraged. But when a young person dies, we are a little outraged. Why? Because that shouldn't happen. And the same is true with all pain and with all suffering. If you have to have an operation, the operation is good. But if the operation was supposed to be performed on somebody else, or on the other leg, that's bad. Why? Because that shouldn't happen. So what do we mean when we say something bad happened? We mean something that shouldn't have happened did happen. So by definition, death is not bad. Pain is not bad. Loss is not bad by definition. It's the thought that it shouldn't have happened that makes it bad. And that's why when we understand what's going on, we feel much better. We can handle it. Like labor pain. If we didn't know what it was, we couldn't survive it. A woman would not survive those kinds of pains if she didn't know what it was all about. Knowing what it's all about makes a huge difference. And by the way, just knowing that everything that happens for a purpose, even when we don't know the purpose, it helps a lot. Because the one thing we really can't stand is the thought that something is happening meaninglessly, without any purpose, without any rhyme or reason. That meaninglessness is totally unacceptable to the human spirit. Pain we can handle, but meaningless pain, pointless, no, that we can't handle. And that's because we're so convinced that life has a purpose, that things happen for a reason, and that the world is not a jungle. So when things appear to be a jungle, when we're convinced that something happened that should not have happened, that we can't handle. That we call bad. The sages, on the other hand, never asked, why do bad things happen to good people? Because the sages knew that nothing bad ever happens. If the definition of bad is that which should not have happened, well, if it shouldn't have happened, then it couldn't have happened. Nothing happens unless there's a reason. Nothing happens unless God makes it happen. So if God is making it happen, it's for a reason. So to say it happened without reason is like saying that there's some other force besides God, like another God, a bad God, a small God that likes to do mischief. And things happen because of this other power or this other force. So God did not mean for it to happen. It was not part of the plan. It was not intended, but it happened anyway. Well, that's not possible. What isn't supposed to happen does not happen because there is no other mover and shaker other than God. So to the sages, nothing bad ever happened. Nothing bad could ever happen. And that's not whitewashing the pain. That's simply recognizing that nothing moves unless there's a mover. Nothing happens unless there's a creator. And nothing happens unless the plan calls for it. And so as painful as life was for the sages themselves, they never thought of it as bad. They thought of it as suffering. And as we said, suffering by definition is not necessarily bad. So to the sages, the question was, why do the righteous suffer, even though it's not bad? And this is the first lesson that we need to learn. It's not enough to object when we think something went wrong. Everybody objects to that. Children, it's not fair. How come? Every kid has a sense of justice, maybe not a very well developed, but everybody has this sense of, no, that shouldn't happen. And they object. But if we were to find out that, yes, it was supposed to happen, would we then accept graciously all the suffering and all the pain in the world? Probably. Probably. Without trying to get into the brain or the mind of a Nazi, how could they so casually, so cavalierly kill a bunch of people, burn them and gas them, and then go home and have supper and enjoy their family and be a gentleman and listen to classical music and study philosophy? How did they do that? They did that because they understood why Jews need to be killed. It made sense to them, it was justified, so it was not bad and therefore not even objectionable. That's monstrous. The Jewish value system says nothing bad will ever happen. Pain is meant to be. And that makes it acceptable to you? Now when you see somebody suffering and you know that it's meant to be, now it doesn't bother you that the person is in pain? When a woman is in labor for hour after hour after hour, we know what it is. And if you're biblical in your orientation, you know that God declared that children will be born in pain. So everything's fine. Nothing's wrong. Nothing bad is happening. So you just sit there and listen to somebody cry and scream in agony, and it doesn't bother you? You're a monster. So what Judaism tells us is two seemingly contradictory statements. On the one hand, stop worrying about bad things happening to good people. Bad things don't happen. Not to good people, not to bad people. They can't happen. Because bad means it wasn't meant to be. If it wasn't meant to be, then it doesn't be. And on the other hand, just because it's meant to be doesn't mean that you should be comfortable with it. God came to Avraham and said, I am going to personally destroy the city of Sodom because I find them guilty and I find them deserving of annihilation. Okay. Nothing bad is happening. It's all great. It's all good. But the thought of so many people dying made Avraham so uncomfortable that he argued again and again and again, because we're not supposed to be complacent. We're not supposed to be comfortable with human suffering, even when we know that there is no mistake and that it's all meant to be. So when Moshe comes back to God and says, why did you make it worse for the people? He knew all the answers about why they're suffering and how suffering will eventually make us stronger, and suffering will eventually end and it will turn into pleasure. And that didn't make it any easier to see his fellow Jew suffering. And so he complained. Because when you're in pain, you complain. So here's the secret. When a person is suffering, they should feel the pain and they should complain about the pain. You sometimes see people who, God forbid, go through a real loss and their reaction is so positive that you almost wonder, like, this isn't healthy. Why are you so positive? Why aren't you mourning and grieving and carrying on the way you're supposed to? But on the other hand, to start doubting the value of life because of these things that are happening, that's not acceptable either. So you must feel the pain without developing the cynicism, without losing respect for life. That's the purpose of these conversations that we're going to have. How do you experience the pain? Not run away from it, not whitewash it, not make believe it's not there because you believe in God and therefore everything's good and everything's fine. We are commanded to grieve when there's a loss. And not for an hour and not for a day, but 7 days. And to some degree for 30 days. And to some degree for a year. So there's no running away from the pain. There's no ignoring it. But at the same time, the pain does not confuse us. The pain does not change our attitude towards life. If anything, it makes life more precious. So, do bad things happen to good people? Bad things don't happen. Do painful things happen? Yes. Do terrible? Yes. But for no reason, that's not possible. Because without a reason, nothing happens. Nothing. Finally, if you're going to ask, why do bad things happen to good people? You obviously are coming from a place of belief. You obviously believe in God. Because if you don't believe in God, and you don't believe that good people are supposed to be rewarded and bad people are supposed to suffer, then what is your question? You cannot believe in evolution and then complain that there's pain. It's all part of the evolution. What do you want? You know, if people are dying, it's probably the natural selection that weeds out the weak. Something horrible like that. So if you don't believe in God, then you don't have that question in the first place. Which means that if you do have the question, it's an expression of your faith in God, not your lack of faith. So a Jew who complains about the Holocaust, even to the point where he refuses to do mitzvahs, and he refuses to participate in Jewish activity because he's so angry about it, that's an act of emunah. He really believes in God, and he really blames God for what happens, which is correct. His conclusion is not necessarily helpful, but it's not a lack of faith. So a person who says, I don't believe in God because bad things happen to good people, that sounds like a contradiction. If you don't believe in God, then bad things don't happen to good people because there are no good people and there are no bad things. There's just evolution. We're just evolving. We were monkeys and we're becoming something else, and we're just in the middle, in the process. So a person who feels distressed about bad things happening to good people, that's a good sign. If you didn't care, it would be a lot worse. Now, one final thought. When we object to pain and suffering when we see it in other people, that is a very moral position. When Avraham heard that God was going to destroy the city of Sodom, it bothered him terribly, and he demanded the justice. But when he was going to lose his son, when God asked him to sacrifice Yitzchak and send him back to heaven as an offering, as a sacrifice, Avraham did not complain. Well, what about me? But I don't want to lose my son. But he's my future. Never complained. When we don't complain about our own pain, there's a virtue to that. If you don't complain about other people's pain, there's nothing nice about it. So if you want to be a martyr, if you want to suffer silently and graciously, that's wonderful. If you want to justify your own pain, that's great. That's a sign of maturity, it's a sign of wisdom, but never somebody else's pain. A quick story. A wealthy chassid was speaking with the previous Rebbe's father 3 generations ago, back in Russia, and he was telling the Rebbe how he had lost his fortune, and he was impoverished. Another chassid approached as they were speaking, who was also a wealthy man, and heard what the conversation was about. So he comforted his friend and said, God knows what he's doing, it'll all turn out fine. That year, the second man, wealthy man, lost his fortune. And he came to the Rebbe, bemoaning his fate. And the Rebbe said to him, you see, when the other guy lost his fortune, you said, God knows what he's doing. You're a great believer. But that was the wrong response. You should not have justified God. You should have justified the pain that the chassid was feeling for having lost his fortune. Now you see what it feels like. Now you're not justifying God. So you would think if somebody says, don't feel so terrible, don't get discouraged, everything will be fine, it's all for the good, that's not necessarily the right moral response. If it was your loss, and you say to yourself, it'll be fine, it's all for a purpose, we'll get back on our feet again, and so on, that's impressive. That's impressive. But when you say it about somebody else's misfortune, it's not nice. So now we need to understand, how do we graciously accept pain? How do we continue to be enthusiastic about life when we see so much suffering around us? How do we go about this? Even after we know that it's not bad, it is still very difficult and painful. So to be continued, now that we know what the problem is and we've kind of taken the edge off by knowing that there is no loss of control on God's part and life never goes wrong. Now let's figure out, what do we do with this mess? Now that we know it's our job, how do we do it?
Just to jump in with one of the questions that were just submitted, if we shouldn't be comfortable with suffering, how is it that God is comfortable with suffering? And if he's comfortable with it, then shouldn't we be in his image and be comfortable with it as well?
That is such a good question if it were true. The assumption that God is not suffering, that's a nasty assumption. We tend to think that God is superhuman, invulnerable, and therefore can't possibly be suffering. But as we were explaining this, feeling the pain of others is not a weakness. It's a moral virtue. And if it's a moral virtue, how could God not have it? So if God can be indifferent to human suffering, we haven't made him greater, we've made him lesser. We've diminished God. So we know, for example, all the midrashim that tell us how God suffers. That when the angels wanted to sing their mourning song when the Egyptians were drowning in the sea, God was annoyed. What are you singing? People are drowning. My creations are drowning. How could you sing at a time like this? So to think that we are more sensitive and more moral in our feelings than God himself, how did that happen? Where did that come from? So maybe this story would help. There was a man called Onkelos. He was a convert to Judaism, a Roman. And he was so holy that his Aramaic translation of the Torah is printed in every version and every edition of the Chumash. Right alongside the text of the Torah, there's the Aramaic. And when Rashi needs to know what a word means, he consults the Aramaic and knows that that's authoritative. That's how holy this man was. But during the reign of the rule of the Romans in Israel, it was against the law to convert. Even Jews were not allowed to practice Judaism. So the emperor sent soldiers to arrest Onkelos. He was also highly connected to high-ranking officials, related family, and he sent to arrest him. As they were leading him out the door, Onkelos reached up and kissed the mezuzah that was on the door. And the soldier said, "What was that?" And he said, "You have to stand at the door of your king to protect the king. But our king stands at our door to protect us." And that's represented by the mezuzah. They all converted. The emperor sent another troop of soldiers to arrest Onkelos, and the same thing happened. He kissed the mezuzah. They said, "What was that?" He said, "Our king stands at our door to protect us." And they all converted. Now, what exactly happened there? They hear a cute expression or something nice and they convert? Sounds frivolous. They were soldiers. Safe to say that they had had their turn standing guard at the tent or the door or the palace of the emperor. And what is the purpose of a guard at the door? It's not ceremonial, not like in England today. In those days, there was a need to have a guard at the door because any moment the emperor is going to be assassinated. The king will be assassinated. So what is the role and the job of the guard at the door? To absorb the initial attack, to take the first bullet. When Onkelos said to these soldiers, "Our king stands at our door to protect us," they were blown away. They had never heard this concept that God will take a bullet for you, that God can actually bleed for you. Of course, not in the physical, because physical bleeding is not the worst. Godly bleeding is much worse. So this idea that God is vulnerable and that God cares and that God will take a bullet for you, this changed the soldiers completely, turned them around, and they became believers. I don't know if they converted to Judaism and started practicing Shabbos and mikveh. They were converted in their understanding of God. And converted means a radical change. So we have this mistaken notion that God is indifferent, that God is cold, God is removed, God is unreachable, untouchable, unflappable. Not when it comes to moral issues. God is more sensitive to injustice than we are, and that's why he commanded that we pursue justice. We feel a tiny part of his pain because we are created in his image. So the fact that one human being can actually feel the pain of another, that's a divine gift. That's what makes us a little more than human. So certainly God has that infinitely more than we do. So then the question is, why does he put up with the suffering? That's a good question. We will pursue that.
There are over 100 people that submitted over 100 questions that they would like to be answered on this topic, and they cover a very wide variety of ways of approaching this topic. For instance, why do good things happen to bad people?
Now that question really bothers me.
Questions like, my wife always asks me, how did Hashem allow the Holocaust? It's a good question. Bothers a lot of people. Some more questions like, what's the best way to handle a tragedy?
Yeah. Let me just make an observation on that. Why did God allow a Holocaust? Obviously, we can't get into God's mind and explain what he's seeing or what he's planning. But consider this, not as an answer to your question, but as an addition to your question. If God is infinitely more sensitive than we are, if it bothers him when bad people are dying, like the Egyptians drowning in the sea, the question should be not only why would God allow it, why would God do that to himself? Why would he inflict so much pain on himself? Now that's a cosmic question. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that God doesn't care, it's just we who suffer. That's a distorted picture. So the question is, how could God put up with the pain that he feels, infinite pain, over every ache that a human being suffers? God suffers infinitely. So the death of 6 million, not to mention all the pain that they experienced before they died, until they died, why would he do that to himself? What could possibly be so important that he would be willing to go through that himself? There's got to be something awesome. And that's why if we try to answer it, we're just going to make fools of ourselves. We can't even think of anything that great that could possibly justify that much pain. So we should never try to explain the tragedies in history. It's an insult to life. It's an insult to God. So when people say, well, the Holocaust at least gave us the land of Israel, don't do that. Don't do that. It's insulting. 6 million people died so that another 6 million can live in Israel? Where's the sense of that? Let's not do that. It is much more honest to say, have no idea. It boggles the mind. Have no idea. But knowing that God is suffering, meaning if he's doing it for a very good reason, because he is not indifferent. Just knowing that there's a reason, even if I don't know what that reason is comforting, is necessary. for our own sanity and our own survival.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Friedman. I would like to take this opportunity to invite everybody that is online, everybody that's on Facebook, everybody listening to this and that will listen to the recording after. We are going to be doing a 3-part webinar on this topic to dive more deeply into this topic, to have more time to expound, to answer all the questions that came in. Like I said, over 100 questions did come in. For those of you that signed up, an email was sent to you with a link to the course. The link to the course can be clicked on. You can reach it by going to our website. It's goodtoknow.org. Again, a 3-part course. Every question will be answered. All topics will be discussed. And if you go now, there's even a bonus. It's actually the set of CDs that Rabbi Friedman created on the Tehillim in honor of his good friend Reb Shomer Charabashkin. You can get those for free for signing up. So please do go ahead and either click your email or go to our website. It's goodtoknow.org. Join us for a very fascinating and hopefully not a very painful subject, but hopefully this will lessen the pain or at least give us some perspective on the pain. And we look forward to seeing you all there joining our course. Thank you very much. Next time we come together should be for only good news, and have a wonderful, wonderful night.